and efficient outreach missionary campaigns at the early half of the century. And they came to America with the goal of teaching and spreading Islam. And some of their early organizers and teachers, like a man named Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, once he came to America and was faced with the racism that he experienced, he immediately saw the way Islam could be used to attract those who were longing for a greater sense of equality and brotherhood. And so the Ahmadiyas began working with Noble Drew Ali. They also began working with Marcus Garvey, who was a black nationalist leader in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, at that time the largest black mass movement in the country. And they frequented Marcus Garvey's meetings, they frequented Noble Drew Ali's meetings. There were people who were in Noble Drew Ali's community who drifted towards the Ahmadiyya that led them to study and learn Arabic, and they went on to found some of the first Sunni Muslim communities in America. In the late 30s and early 40s, the first Muslim mosque of Cleveland, the first Muslim mosque of Pittsburgh, in Newark and in Philadelphia. Some of the oldest African-American Sunni Muslim communities originate out of this kind of marriage between Noble Drew Ali's Moorish Science Temple and the Ahmadiyya. Now, in keeping with this whole theme of Islam as an alternative identity, there were many jazz artists who embraced Islam at the time under these movements. And Dizzy Gillespie writes in his memoirs about almost half his band converted to Islam at one time, and he was, when asked about it, he's like, I don't really know if they were Muslim, but I do know when we traveled down south and we tried to go, we had to perform or tried to eat at certain restaurants, those who had Arabic names got to walk in through the front door. And this is part of what I mean with Islam as an alternative identity. The Muslim identity allowed some African Americans to escape the racial hierarchy of America, because you were no longer quote unquote black, right? You were from somewhere else because you were Ahmed or Muhammad or Akbar, right? And so you clearly were not what they would call an American Negro. And there were many, so if you were, an African American, and if you dressed like that, something like that, or had a fez, and your name was now Ahmed Jamal, you were not treated the way African Americans named Johnson and Jones and Smith were treated. And so this is how Islam functioned as offering an alternative identity. And as I mentioned, jazz, there were many jazz artists at the time who began to embrace Islam or became very familiar with it, and some of them were influenced by it in their work, and one of them was John Coltrane. And there's a whole, if you ever, are people familiar with the Love Supreme? How many people are familiar with the Love Supreme? Okay, well you should get to it. It's a beautiful suite, and really it is a Sufi poem put to music. And if you read the liner notes to A Love Supreme, it begins with the name of God, the most gracious, the merciful. And if you're not Muslim, you might be like, oh, that sounds very nice. But if you're Muslim, you will recognize this is how almost every chapter of the Quran begins. In Arabic, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. And so John Coltrane, in A Love Supreme, he has several references to the one God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. And for people familiar with Sufi poetry, much of Sufi poetry is about the relationship of the worshiper to the Supreme Being. And that relationship in Sufi poetry is often characterized as a relationship of lovers. Okay? And so when you read the liner notes and listen to A Love Supreme, that's what comes across. And this is a kind of Sufi poetry put to music. And there are two other kind of connections that you can make with a love supreme. One, at this time, John Coltrane began to play around with different tonal scales, right? Like we think the, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, those are the only tonal scale, but in other cultures, they have different tonal scales. And you can hear him in his playing beginning to incorporate these kind of Eastern tonal scales in his melodies. And in the last, and this might be a stretch, but then it might not, the chanting, some have suggested, of A Love Supreme, which happens in the song that I'm about to play a clip of, is reminiscent of what many Sufis do call Vikr, which is the remembrance of God, where they have a phrase that they chant repeatedly, and sometimes they get into a trance-like mode. And what's interesting is the way A Love Supreme is chanted, it can be easily heard as Allah is Supreme. So that might be a stretch, but everything else is solid. So I'm going to play a clip of A Love Supreme, and you can hear that. Okay, so that was an early 1960s example of Islam as an alternative cultural outlet. And here's the 1980s version, and this is kind of Orientalism run amok. And this is Eric B. and Rakim's, I'm going to have to turn the lights off for this, but when Paid in Full, which, now Eric B. and Rakim, I can talk about them later, but suffice it to say, this song was a major hit in hip-hop circles, and it features a sample of a song called Ibn Alu. And the way it's sampled in the song, and the way it's presented in the video, you think it's Arabic. But Ibn Alu is actually a Hebrew prayer by a Yemeni Hebrew singer named Ofra Hazar, which was a very popular Middle Eastern artist. In fact, their use of this sample kind of like remixes all over. But the way it's presented and positioned in this video, and this is a 1987 video, so it's very cheesy, kind of pastiche, but when her sample comes up, what scrolls on the screen is Arabic script, actually Quranic script. And it's set against images of belly dancing, it's set against images of prayer. So again, here is that kind of idea of Islam as an Eastern culture, but I say Orientalism run amok because it completely elides any, distinctions about what's being represented. So hopefully you guys can see it.
This is a journey into sound. This is a journey into sound. A journey which along the way will bring to you new color, new dimension, new depth. Lord, ready? I told this switch. Pump up the volume, pump up the volume. Pump that beat.
Thinking of the master plan is like one of the all-time greatest opening lines of any hip-hop song. But anyway, so you see what I mean there with the way Islam is represented in that. Now here is a more, I think, politically potent and accurate example of this Islam functioning as if not an alternative identity, a bridge to other identities. And in this case, instead of Orientalism, I call this transnationalism. Because of, the kind of initial exposure to Islam that many African Americans had, even though it came through like Noble Drew Ali and these kinds of Orientalist representations, it inspired many people to discover those cultures, to reach out to those cultures. And I'll talk a little bit more about him and the movement he came from, but one of those people was Malcolm X. And pushed or motivated by his interest in Islam, Malcolm encountered many people from other parts of the world who were Muslim. And this allowed him to form relationships with them on the basis of Islam, right? And one of those, and this is an appropriate, I don't know, did Mubarak give his speech? Did somebody, what he did? What did he decide to do? He's staying right where he is? Okay. Well, then this is still very much relevant. I actually just wrote a piece for theroot.com, which is an online publication of the Washington Post, and I wrote a piece called The Crisis in Egypt, Their Problem is Our Problem, and it comes from this clip, actually. So part of this kind of bridge that Islam has between African Americans and Muslims in other parts of the world was experienced by the Nation of Islam, which I'll talk a little bit more a little later. But in 1957, Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, wrote Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the first president of Egypt, expressing solidarity with Nasser. They were having a meeting, African-Asian conference. And Nasser wrote back to Elijah Muhammad with best wishes for our African and Asian brothers and sisters in America. And what began was an exchange on the basis of Islam between African Americans and people in other parts of the world, and in this particular case, Egypt. And so in 1959, Malcolm travels to Egypt as an emissary of Elijah Muhammad, and he meets with Nasser. And then Elijah Muhammad follows soon thereafter. He also meets with Nasser. And then sends two of his sons to Al-Azhar University. Akbar Muhammad, who teaches, I think, at SUNY Binghamton, right? And the late Imam W.D. Muhammad. And they received their Islamic education there. And Imam Muhammad, I'll talk about it later, would be the one who would kind of usher in this series of changes in the Nation of Islam when he assumed leadership. So there's now, because of this, so Islam is, yes, part of a historical recovery, and yes, it is an alternative identity, but it's also a bridge to other ways of seeing the world. And 5 years later, Malcolm was no longer in the nation, but he went back to Cairo. And he went because Egypt was hosting the meeting of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. And Malcolm went to the meeting of the OAU to convince the delegates of these newly independent African states to bring the case of African Americans to the United Nations as a case of violation of human rights. And in this interview clip, he talks about why he's in Egypt, and I thought it's a great clip to illustrate these kinds of transnational connections that were formed with Islam, but also especially poignant for the moment that we're in, because Malcolm voices a kind of global, a sense of global citizenship and global responsibility.
Malcolm, what is your purpose here? Well, my purpose here is to remind the African desert states that there are 22 million of us in America who are also of African descent, and to remind them also that we are the victims of America's colonialism or American imperialism, and that our problem is not an American problem, it's a human problem. It's not a Negro problem, it's a problem of humanity, not a problem of civil rights, but a problem of human rights. And what do you hope for from this conference? Well, we hope to bring pressure upon them, or rather we hope to impress upon them the importance of their bringing pressure and world opinion upon the United States to take some meaningful